Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar on reuse, repair, refurbishment, resale of cricket gear. This is based on a series of research that we've been undertaking with myself, Martin Charter, and my colleague Joanna. And Joanna is there. Do you want to say anything, Joanna?
Yeah, just to give a quick introduction, my background is in the apparel industry. I worked across supply chains for about the past 20 years, and then most recently have specialised in sports and how sports equipment can be reutilized in line with the circular economy.
So you'll be hearing a bit more from Joey in a short while, this is part of some work we've been doing for the last sort of couple of years around sustainability and particularly cricket gear, but looking at also at the other spin-offs into other sportswear. I also need to sort of just say thank you very much to Research England for funding to enable us to do this. And I'm from the Centre for Sustainable Design at University for the Creative Arts, and UCA is effectively the second largest supplier of graduates to the creative industry in Europe. So our centre was set up in 1995, so we've been looking at sustainability and products for some time. We're splitting into sort of three elements to the presentation, so I'll just give a brief overview of some of the issues, and then Joe will focus in on the 3Rs research she's been doing, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask any questions, and then there'll be a presentation on the cricket, I still struggle to say it, cricket case study, and a how-to-do guide that we've developed or are finalising on how to set up reuse schemes in cricket clubs, and some further ideas. So without further ado, I'll crack on and start with a bit of an overview. So many of these things, of course, we know, but cricket is the second largest sport globally. About 300 million people playing, according to the ICC, 300,000 in England and Wales. It's one of the sports most likely to be impacted by climate change, and we've already seen evidence of this, in terms of heat, smogs, etc., etc. It's one of the most gear-intensive sports. We reckon probably ice hockey is the second one, but again, we're dealing, generally speaking, with a lack of research around sustainability and sports gear more generally, and particularly in cricket. There's been very, very little research completed in this area, and this is part of what we're focusing on. So cricket gear itself includes many sort of multiple components that are not easy to refurbish or degrade or compost, and most of the gear is ending up in landfill, and there's been little attempt so far to design for circularity. So there are relatively few reuse organisations for cricket gear in the UK. The Lord's Taverners is the most significant player, and you will hear about it in a little bit. Cricket is a unique reuse scheme that's been initiated in Yorkshire that is really having some impact. The reuse area is perhaps coming potentially more into focus, as we're seeing more challenges in terms of the cost of living, and less money to go around. And if you have kids or a couple of kids that want to play cricket, the budgets can build up for the gear, for coaching, for travel. So the whole issue of affordability, participation, and potential role for reuse of cricket gear to support that is perhaps coming into focus. And of course, there's a big focus in the game on increasing participation at all levels. What we see is that the the production and assembly of cricket gear has virtually disappeared from the UK. According to the Heritage Crafts organisation that complete a review of craft products each year, they've identified that cricket ball making is extinct in the UK, other than some involvement from Dukes. But again, production of cricket balls very concentrated in northern Pakistan and northern India. And also cricket bat making has been defined as endangered. It was in a worse situation a while ago, but it seems there have been some new bat manufacturers that have started to emerge over the last couple of years. But again, there's a lot of outsourced production to northern India and Pakistan, bats coming over, that may have logos added by small companies, and so the actual physical production of the gear has pretty well, other than some specific cases, disappeared. As a result of our research, we found that a significant proportion of cricket gear is going to end of life without reuse or repair or refurbishment. And these are some best guess judgments we've made with some quite detailed assumptions behind it that we have recently revised. But we can see some sort of quite specific numbers there. And in our reports, we detail that, we detail the assumptions behind this. So nobody's really tried to identify these figures in the past. But we have tried to do it as a starter for 10, but we're very happy for others to work with us on building and getting more clarity on this, and getting data has proved to be difficult. So as I mentioned, we've been undertaking a series of research and projects, and we're at a stage broadly around circular cricket gear. And we have actually a specific circular cricket gear project going on at the moment that will run to the end of August. And then we have various projects that have fed into this, from a project looking at the use of vegan leather within cricket gear that utilizes leather. We've done some detailed research, and we've even developed some sort of experiments and prototyping there. We've got a couple of other projects that we're going to hear about today that around repair reuse that feed into this work, and also the work with cricket to understand their case study and to look at how to approach to help set up reuse schemes, building on the excellent experience from Yorkshire. And we're also looking at a methodology with the Lord's Taverners to try and understand the carbon emissions associated with reuse. This builds on other experience we have of building a repair carbon calculator in a repair cafe that I'm involved in, but that's another story. So we're working with various collaborators and partners in the project, from manufacturers to materials to sports organisations to standards bodies. We are, from all of our different projects, we've developed a web-based platform where we're making sure all of the reports are available and the recordings from webinars. So there's a good resource building under the PASIC platform, the platform for the acceleration of sustainable innovation in cricket. So a big resource growing there that is unique. One of the things that we've started to explore, and Joe and I have developed this model. This is the best we could think of, calling it the Golden Triangle. It sounds like a Hollywood film to do with Tibet, but it's this idea about how the various elements link together. So if we were to expand reuse programs for cricket gear, that potentially, you know, has a benefit environmentally by extending the life of existing products, materials and components. So it's had an environmental benefit. It would also have an economic benefit in potentially reducing the making cricket gear more affordable to different groups that are more under pressure to do with the budget crisis, which would then lead to potentially more participation with all the benefits from a you know, physical, mental and community well-being perspective. So Joe will touch on this in a bit more detail later on. And of course, for all of us who are engaged with or watching the game, we are aware of the landmark report by the ICEC around you know, many of these issues to do with access, equality, etc., etc. So many of the things that we have been researching and we'll talk about in the webinar, and indeed the Golden Triangle, will align very closely to some of the findings from this report. So without further ado, I'll pass across to Joe.
Thank you, Martin. If you could move to the next slide. The 3 R's really stand for reuse, repair and refurbishment. And that was the focus of the first report that we're going to discuss. We also examined resale, as this really facilitates reuse. So this was another area that we looked into. And then I'll expand more on the Golden Triangle, which Martin introduced. And just to set the scope of the project, we focused this within England and Wales, and it was really about the use phase of the product. So looking at what impact the player could have once they'd bought their kit, what could they do to extend its product life? And we excluded bats from this because they have an established repair network, and we also excluded clothing because, again, the repair network was quite different. So it was really focused on items such as gloves, helmets and batting pads. And then we gave this the context of the 10 R's framework. So again, the focus is really on the reuse, repair and refurbish. Martin, if you want to briefly just share the other projects and how they fit in with the other R's and give more context to the 10R framework. Or you're on mute.
That just to add to the points that we have looked at the whole redesign element of batting pads and gloves, and I'll introduce something we looked at on gloves. But the work on the cricket pads we will be sharing in more detail towards the end of August when we've developed a demonstrator product. So the other element that, as Joe mentioned, this is an established framework that's been utilised around circular economy thinking. But as Joe mentioned, we would also add resale to this because it's an element, if you like, of reuse, facilitated reuse. But also upcycling is another aspect that has emerged. You know, there have been attempts to upcycle cricket bats, for example, into benches. And I think that's more artwork at the moment, but there are other dimensions. But it is a very useful framework to use to think through these issues. And I'll move on to the next slide for Joe.
And I would just say it's important to remember that it is a hierarchy. So the goal really is to look at reuse, so extending the product life of goods that are already there. In terms of reuse, we did an analysis of all the reuse organisations in the UK, those that were specific to cricket, but those that also had other areas. We found that Lord's Tavern and Sport Kit Recycling was the largest and most established. They work nationally, so they accept donations from many different hubs, and then they centralise those donations. We have Crit Kit, which we will talk about in more detail later. They're focused in Yorkshire and really focused on reutilising those products locally. And then we have Cricket Asylum Foundation Kit Library. And this runs more in terms of almost like a lending library. So these top three have different logistic models essentially. But Cricket and Cricket Asylum are really focused on reducing barriers to play and encouraging participation by providing equipment within local areas. Bat for Chance and No Boundaries / Cricket Kindness are reuse organisations that we'd identified in earlier reports. So Bat for Chance collects garments and equipment and reuses some of those overseas. And Cricket Kindness was founded by an Australian woman. She's since returned to Australia and it's now been incorporated into No Boundaries. And again, they're following a similar format to how it was run as Cricket Kindness. And then there's Play It Again Sport and Together for Sport. And these are organisations which, again, work within a locality, but really focus on all sports. So they accept all kind of sports and equipment clothing. It's not specific to cricket. And then next slide. The key thing is really about condition. Within these reuse organisations, the condition of donated items did vary. Now, that was potentially due to a few different variables. One of them, for example, with Lord's Taverners Sport Kit Recycling, it's a national scheme, so it can be donated from anywhere. And there's almost an anonymity to donating them. So in comparison to where you would take something and you'd have to hand it over locally, potentially you're not going to donate heavily used items if almost there's a face to that donation. So these images are from a site visit to Lord's Taverners, and you can see that there's a lot of damage to some of them and they appear visibly well worn. A lot of the issues were to do with staining, especially on palms of gloves. There was also holes. And we noticed that the outer surface of some of these products were really starting to crack. The integrity of the product was fine. So in terms of Lord's Taverners, they viewed it as still being okay for use, and 95% of everything that they receive, they reuse. So it's important to kind of understand actually the conditions of these donations really do vary. So you have donations like this, but also ones which are kind of new and still in packaging and have never been worn. And then in terms of logistics, it really depends on how the scheme is structured. Is it a national scheme or is it a more localized scheme? So the map that you see here are all the collection points for Lord's Taverners Sports Kit Recycling. And you can see that although they are spread across the country, there are certain geographical areas that have more donation points. And then there's also some quite big gaps in there as well. And collection points really rely on local clubs volunteering to be a point of collection. If you have a more localized scheme, it could just be that you have one collection point that you accept donations, and also that collection point is the point where people can pick up items that they need. The model also really affects how product is sorted. So for Lord's Taverners Sports Kit Recycling Scheme, they would accept everything, unbag it, look at the quality, make sure everything could be used. And then they would also try and pair it into sets, and they would sort it within their warehouse. Now, because it's a national scheme, they have a warehouse that everything is kept in. Whereas for other more localized schemes, they might not have the space, and actually there's no sorting that is done. You know, things are just donated to one particular collection area, and then people who need those items can come and collect them. It is a balance between donation versus demand, and all of the reuse organizations that we interviewed shared this, because it can be quite unpredictable, in terms of how they grow their schemes. So for example, Lord's Taverners, they need to get an idea of how much donations they're going to receive to understand how much warehouse space they're going to need to allocate. You might have high periods of demand with low donation. So it's trying to merge those two together. And I think that was feedback from all the reuse schemes. It can be hard to do that. Whereas we've seen with localized schemes, actually, if you use social media and press, you can kind of encourage donations and then encourage people to come for reuse. So I think also being strategic in how you put the messaging out around donations is really key. Something that was common to all reuse organizations, both cricket and those that covered all sports, was that a lot of them were volunteer led. Those that were funded, a lot of the people who worked there went above and beyond their job title, you know, often working longer hours, and kind of going above what was expected, you know, in terms of things like cleaning product. Some people took products home and put it in their washing machine, washed it and ironed it. So there was a lot of passion and purpose that was really behind these schemes. We also have identified an issue in terms of brand barriers. So this was more of an issue for clothing, but we found that some large brands would not allow the reuse of their product within the UK, and therefore it had to be reused overseas. There's more research needed to really understand contractually how this works, and specifically, you know, if there's ways around to reduce those barriers. The common thing that we found was most of these schemes were underfunded. Cricket Kindness, for example, was self-funded by the founder, Tamara. A lot of the schemes have to pitch for funding every year. So Play It Again Wales, they rely on lottery funding, for example. So we know that actually they're underfunded and they're relying heavily on people's goodwill to make these work, but they have a huge responsibility because the impact that we see from these reuse schemes is massive. And this is explored more within the Golden Triangle, but it is clear that they have social, economic and environmental benefits. We also saw some uneven donations. So there might be one item instead of a pair. So there might be one glove of a pair rather than both gloves. And we even found that people who worked within the reuse organisation wouldn't throw that glove away. They would keep it in the hope that they could find another pair to the glove. And we even found reuse organisations kind of connecting on this. So Cricket, for example, will send their single gloves to Lord's Taverners in the hope that they can make a pair. So it's really kind of going to the next degree to be able to salvage some of this product. We have also seen some element of bias between reuse schemes. So some reuse schemes have said to us there is not a huge need for product to be reused in the UK. It's just not a need, it's more needed overseas. And then other reuse schemes, particularly those that are heavily connected within the community, have said absolutely, you know, the cost of kit is a barrier to play, and therefore if it's a choice between not playing and using used kit, we'll happily take the used kit. And in the Cricket study I'll talk about later, we found that actually there was a huge issue with schools not being able to afford equipment, and so state schools weren't able to actually teach cricket because they couldn't afford to provide the equipment. And then just on the right of the screen, you can see the type of communication that Lord's Taverners have put out in terms of the equipment that they will take. Each reuse organisation communicated differently about condition. So, for example, Cricket Asylum were very down to earth, and they said, you know, we don't want items that have been used to death. We only want items that have been outgrown. So all of them stressed that they wanted good quality items, but they all had different ways of communicating that out to people who were donating. In terms of repair and refurbishment, we didn't really see any commercial examples within the UK. This is one example that we did find in terms of wicket keeper gloves. But this repair, for example, would cost about £36. And if we think the wicket keeper glove new could be between £40 to £120, it really depends on whether you see a good return in investment in doing that repair as a player. And I think that really comes down to, you know, lack of skills within the UK. We did see a huge amount of repair skills overseas, for example, in India, but also the cost of those repairs was much lower. The person who was doing the repairs would make approximately £4 per day profit for doing a day's full of repairs. So you can see actually the commercial model is completely different. And within the UK, there is a lack of skills and a different perspective on the value of skills of repair. There is also concerns about liability, as cricket is defined now as PPE, you know, in terms of things like helmets and pads. If they're repaired and there's any safety issues with them, where does the liability lie? In terms of opportunities and challenges, I'm going to pass to Martin now to talk about his experience really with repair cafes and how those could fit in with repair and refurbishment. Oh, Martin, you're on mute again.
So for those who aren't aware of repair cafes are community workshops where effectively people will bring in broken products, and then you'll get expert volunteers who will repair those products. There's approximately 250 to 300 now in the UK, over 2,500 worldwide. We actually went out. Unfortunately, I'm quite heavily involved in this, so we ran the UK Repair Cafe conference with 90 people involved, and we asked, could you do anything with cricket gear? And then we went back out to the list, and effectively what we found was there were some of the repair cafes who did leather work, like bags or cases or things like this, but it wasn't a major demand area, and the skills were not easy to find. Whilst there might be potential for repair cafes, it's not as obvious as we thought it might be. There might be opportunities maybe for very specific repair cafe type models that might be run, for example, within county setups or whatever. The other thing that I'll just mention before I pass back to Joe is, as a result of trying to produce our prototype products, more circular cricket pad products that we'll be able to talk more about at the end of August. We've been trying to go out and find networks of sort of making skills, those with industrial sewing skills, industrial sewing machines, and the relevant skills to, for example, unpick, sew, etc., gloves, pads. And it's proving to be more difficult than we thought it might be. So it goes back down to a lot of those traditional skills have gone or are going or have migrated, in this sector to northern India, Pakistan, or elsewhere. So there's still, some challenges there. I'll pass back to Joe.
And just a point on customer communication in terms of how to maintain your product. We looked at analysis of a number of different cricket retailers to see if they offered any advice in terms of product maintenance. It was very few and far between. It was, for example, if you're going to keep your pads in your bag, keep the straps done up, wear inner gloves, switch between two pairs of gloves. It was very limited in terms of supporting players in how they could extend the product life. And there was no take back schemes that were found, or no in-brand kind of repair or refurbishment that was found, within the research that we've done.
So now just briefly, I'll interject with a brief case study, some work that we did on retrofitting and refurbishing some cricket gloves. So this is my colleague Lillian, who's has an ex-product design background. She's on holiday this afternoon, so she couldn't attend, so I'm doing my best. So we received some gloves from a Premier League player in the Nottinghamshire area, and so he donated a pair of gloves that he'd stopped using. And this is a sort of starting point. You can sort of start to see some of the faults, if you like, occurring in the gloves. And again, you could sort of start to see here, where the problems were occurring, around stitching, the palms, the ends of the fingers. And what my colleague did is she then disassembled the gloves and unpicked the stitching, and because of the age of the product, she found once she got there's probably technical terms for this, but she started to remove the stitches. Actually, they came out relatively easy because of the age of the product. So she's able to disassemble it into the component parts. And she moves through the sort of process to do this. And then effectively what we then did was to retrofit the gloves with some with a commercially available vegan leather. So she was able to do this. It was a 3-hour process. She thinks she could do it quicker next time, but it's still 3 hours. But I think this is roughly the time that even the commercial let's say individual makers would take. So it is quite a labor intensive process to make as well as refurbish. And then what we did was we did a bit of user testing with the player, and it was quite interesting in the sense of relatively small usage, and there was already some challenges with the material there. So the material not being, because we'd taken this vegan leather that was used for cleaning windows and applied it to a new application, it was not appropriate for this usage. It did have properties that were relevant, but this was an experiment, and so there was 2 elements. It started to fray relatively quickly. It didn't have the integrity of the animal leather. And also because of the thickness of the vegan leather, you didn't have the sort of feel on the bat handle that you would have with a conventional batting glove. So it was an interesting experiment, and we learned various lessons, including be very careful about selecting the gloves in the first place to make sure they don't stink of sweat. Unfortunately, Lillian had to wear a clothes peg throughout the whole process of the refurbishment. So there's, other, let's say, barriers that you wouldn't necessarily even think about until you actually do it. So I'll pass back to Jo.
Thanks, Martin. Now I'm going to move into more detail in terms of the 3 Rs. There's been quite a lot of external motivators for resale. We're all experiencing a huge cost of living crisis. The latest stats from the 28th of June to the 9th of July this year from the Office of National Statistics were that 46% reported it was very or somewhat hard to afford the rent or mortgage at the moment. So we're at a time where people are more financially squeezed than ever, so they may consider selling products that they have or buying products that are already used. There's an increasing sustainability awareness. So in some reports, about 57% of consumers are aware of sustainability and would use this as a criteria for purchase, but we still see quite a big attitudes and behavior gap. So although lots of people say that they are focused on sustainability, we do not always see it reflected within their purchasing decisions. There's also been a trend towards minimalism. So there's a lot of people that have gone through their garages and their wardrobes, especially during COVID, are now looking to sell items which could be considered stored waste. And during COVID-19, the practice of having things like a shared kit bag was prohibited. So a lot of people had to, when they started to play again, buy their own equipment. So potentially as children grow, a lot of this equipment now might be obsolete for that child and now being looked at for resale. So we did an analysis in terms of who are the key online resellers. eBay is the largest. But then also Vinted is one of the most popular ones for clothing and also for kids items. So we went through eBay and Vinted and kind of looked at different search terms to identify, how many different items were available and in what kind of price range, and also what was the category of condition, so that we could see, how many were kind of good or nearly new, because especially when we think of product that is new or nearly new and the significant price reductions that we can get, if it's not kind of bought from retail, but bought almost a second hand. There's online retail sites like Facebook Marketplace. The unique thing about this is that it allows you to search within a certain geographical area. So you can say, I want to search within 5 miles of my home. So that allows you to go and physically collect items rather than them being posted. And we're also seeing the emergence of specialist resellers. So Kids 3R is one that focuses on kids' hobbies, specifically kind of sports equipment, because the founder really saw that there's items that had lots of life left that could be reused. In terms of resale, when we did the analysis, there was some inaccurate search results. So when we looked at cricket, for example, there is a shop in Liverpool called Cricket. So it returned a lot of women's shoes from that store. So it was really about terminology and ease of search terms. And I think for online resale, this is fundamental, that the functionality of the site has to really work for people to be able to find that key product. The condition of goods was very subjective, so it really depended on the seller's point of view on it. So some people could class things as new without tags, and other people might consider that just in good condition. And so that also affected the pricing. You know, some people who might have bought something new and hardly used it wanted to almost get their return on investment and almost charge the same as the retail price that they paid. Other people just wanted to kind of get rid of their stuff and were happy to have anything for it at much cheaper prices. There was also this idea of bundling. So a lot of people would put multiple items together. So you might have gloves and pads or shoes and pads. And this was essentially a better offer for the buyer. It added more value, but it also meant that you might end up with a product that you didn't actually want, but you just bought it because you wanted, say, the pads, for example, but actually you got pads and gloves. We also found that sizing could be a bit of an issue. So most resale sites are based on like sizes such as 8, 10, 12 for women, or age groups for kids, and pads, for example, aren't necessarily falling into that same size ratio. So finding the correct sizing could also be a bit more tricky. And it also takes time from the seller to put it on there, to photograph it, to write the copy. So there was an investment in terms of time, and also the time taken to kind of go through your stored waste, find it, clean it up, and as I say, photograph it. And these are some examples of kind of used good and kind of nearly new condition. So you can see the one on the left, you can get trainers and pads for £1. Now, for example, if these were taken to Lord's Taverners, they might say these can be used, they're a usable product, and they would be fine to be reused. The middle one, it's been used 3 times. This is £15, and then you have pads which are still in the bag for £15. So there was really quite a wide range of prices and conditions, but it did show that actually kit was available for much lower prices if you were willing to buy secondhand. And then just in terms of kind of quantifying some of those prices, so this was some research that Kidder did. You can see it's nearly £800 to purchase new kit for juniors. So, for example, if you have 2 children and they want to play cricket, you can be talking, £1,500, £2,000 to kit them out for a game of cricket. And we're finding that is becoming more and more prohibitive to many families. They worked out a pre-loved value about £360, but a lot of these resale organisations, including Cricket, are making these items available for free of cost, so that the affordability barriers are completely removed. And then just to go into some detail in the Golden Triangle, I will go into more detail in the next case study, but what we found during the 3 Rs project was that reuse was most effective when combined with access and provision to sport. So, being able to reuse the kit was great, but actually people wanted to then go on and play it. So making that link between reuse and participation was really important. And when organisations had some kind of community arm where they had access to the sport, it worked well if they kind of partnered up together. 27% of those surveyed for a London sports report said that they would cut back on physical activity due to the rising costs. So I believe we will start to see some people unable to play the sport due to the cost barrier, and potentially they will have to start playing other sports because they just can't afford the kit, or they can't afford to progress in the game to the hard form all of the game. In terms of environmental, most cricket gear does not decompose. It's not been designed with environmental considerations in mind. It is difficult to repair. So the end of life for this is likely just to be landfill. In terms of economic, 52% of those surveyed for the same London Sport report agreed that the rising cost of living had limited their ability to afford both sports and leisure equipment. So people just cannot afford to buy the equipment needed to play gear-intensive sports. We're also seeing examples of extended producer responsibility in other countries, which essentially may place a fee on organisations putting product in the market. Martin, if you want to expand any more on that.
So as Joe is saying, particularly from the European Commission and notably in France and Netherlands and Sweden, there is now regulations that are either in place or being put forward that will require those that place clothing and potentially apparel on the market to set up schemes to recycle those gears. Now, what is very unclear at the moment is whether, cricket gear and apparel would be part of that definition. UK are rather dragging its feet on this issue at the moment and don't have a clear perspective on what they're taking around this agenda. But as of about 2 weeks ago, I've identified there is a DEFRA person who is now looking at this sort of clothing sector, but certainly UK is not being as proactive as perhaps some other countries, but that there is the likelihood over the next 5 years of something happening.
And then next slide. And just to summarise the 3 Rs project, there's a limited number of cricket reuse organisations. Lord's Taverners is the largest and most established, and it's one of the only ones that really works nationally. There's no examples of large-scale repair or refurbishment of cricket gear within England and Wales. And Resale really tends to focus on children and junior cricket gear, and this is mainly driven through the large resale websites. There are technical and safety concerns that can create barriers to reuse, repair and resale of cricket gear, so specifically with pads and especially with things like helmets. The growth in world participation will increase demand for cricket gear, so it's important to look at these issues as it's only going to grow. Economic factors such as the cost of gear given the current cost of living crisis in England and Wales are impacting the ability of players to buy new gear, and they do create barriers to participation. And the link between social, environmental and economic sustainability facilitated by cricket gear needs further research, but we will go into some more depth in the next case study where we look at cricket shortly. But I just wanted to check if anybody has any questions in terms of the 3 Rs. The research was designed to be an overview of all organisations and kind of compare and contrast models and look at what the current situation is. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Yeah, hi Joe, I've got a quick question. It's really interesting what you've gone through, and Martin as well, thank you for putting it all together. I just had a question on the kind of reuse, resale, sorry. Did you find that the people who were reusing or buying the old kit were after a specific item? So they were out there saying, like a pair of GM pads or a GM bat because that's what I use, or were they more browsing for, I need a new set of pads?
I would say they were after specific items. That's generally because in the next case study with cricket, Kendall, who ran the program, would be asked for specific items, which she would then put on a wish list. So there were some people who just almost wanted a bundle. So for example, with Lord's Taverners sports kit recycling, in their application for kit, people who apply must list what articles that they want, because otherwise you tend to find you can give people items that actually they don't need. It was really about the specific one. But I think there is also a case of many people just didn't have any of the items to be able to start, but it mainly became a problem when it was moved to the hard ball form of the game. So where they really needed this protection equipment, it was absolutely key. You know, there might be some items that the club had that they could kind of reuse when they went to the club, but really it was about specifics.
Okay, and that's very useful. And then the follow on from that was, were everyone who was doing this resale and reuse, were they all individuals, or would you get sports clubs or schools coming in and trying to purchase kind of bulk sections of kit?
I mean, if I kind of talk about reuse rather than resale, what happened in reuse is potentially that you would get large private schools who had a lot of kit that they didn't need anymore that would donate them. And then you would also get potentially state schools which needed bulk items of kit for a team. You know, and in some of the research that we did for Crit Kit, we found that there were coaching organizations outside of school where they didn't have items for their team to be able to play matches. So, you know, they were playing in trainers, they didn't have cricket shoes, they didn't have matching whites, for example. So it really depended on the organizations, but for schools, it was about having enough kit to teach a class. And most schools just said the budget that they had didn't allow that. So it was really kind of needing to have at least enough that you could separate, say, groups of 10 to be able to play.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions on the 3 Rs?
I had another question.
Yeah.
Do you, when taking into consideration the 3 Rs, do you look at offsetting in other areas of the overall event? I know this is specifically looked at from an equipment perspective, but for example, in some of the other events I've worked in, we will offset things like planting a tree for an issue of somebody's traveling distance and things like that. I just wondered if anything like that had been considered with this also.
Is that in terms of carbon offsetting?
Not just carbon offsetting, but that as one option, but just generally a lot of the ideas in events generally tend to be, because we're making this mistake, we'll rectify it by doing X, Y, and Z to make up for it, if that makes sense. So it doesn't necessarily have to just come from a carbon offsetting perspective. It can be many other initiatives that are available.
I don't know whether you want to take that, Martin.
I mean, it's not really the focus of what we looked at. We were very explicitly focusing on the gear in that context, rather than those wider issues. There are some sort of classical things that I think companies like Grays Nichols do. So for every willow tree they remove for to produce the cleft for the bats, they will plant two trees. So that's a sort of classical sort of sustainable forestry type of technique, but we haven't looked at this because that's not really the focus of what we've looked at.
And I would also add, it wasn't almost the responsibility of these reuse organizations. The reuse organizations almost ended up with essentially what could be seen as waste product from brands, and they were the ones who were left to deal with it. So, if they weren't there necessarily, a lot of this stuff might have ended up in landfill, but they were the ones who had kind of put themselves in this process. And I think that was the key thing. They were run on kind of passion and purpose by volunteers, when really actually there is a role for some kind of organization to support extending the product life of these garments. The brands did not really take any responsibility for reuse of their items. It was these independent organizations, which were often charity arms.
I just add to that, it's not sort of directly answering the question, but building on Joe's point, is I think we were sort of quite surprised as we got into this more, the level of virtual new gear that moves through the system for a variety of reasons, whether they've overstocked or some of the designs or logos have changed, or there's a variety of reasons why. And I think something cropped up with Lord's Taverners in our last conversation that maybe a retailer went out of business and they suddenly had hundreds of sets of kit turn up. So there's all these sort of slightly unusual things that we're finding as we're getting more into the system. But going back to your point, you know, there may well be, you know, some other broader, you know, ripple effect type of things going on, but that's perhaps for you to research. That's not within the scope of our research, sadly.
It is quite an interesting perspective to listen to from what you're saying, though, because what I'm tending to find from an event perspective generally, so a sporting event for this example, where you guys are focused on such a great area, it's making a difference in that particular area, but then the other areas are kind of making it so you're not falling by the wayside, but it's not making it have the impact sustainable in a sustainable sense as it could if other people were holding their own. So it's interesting to see if within a sporting perspective where the accountability is being
so touching on your point, particularly in cricket, and it will be true for many other sports. I mean, the biggest impact generally, you know, from a, let's say from an analytical point of view, is the venues themselves, and its energy used in the built environment, travel to those venues. So if you're looking at, you know, the bigger picture, that is the priority. And within the very few number of sustainability managers that are employed, and we're talking of a handful in the game, that is their prime focus, reducing energy use of their venues. That's 80% of what they're doing. And they really generally don't pick these issues up. So we're the first to really, you know, have started to look at this in great detail. Ben and Darshil, wherever you are now, Ben, started, you know, looking at, you know, new prototypes, bamboo cricket bats, etc. But there's been relatively little work done on that. So from an analytical point of view, focus on energy in the built environment, but we're focusing on an area that nobody else is really focused on. So anyway, let's perhaps for time move on to the next point.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, Elizabeth, because I work across multiple sports, is often there can be a conflict of interest with this because it's in a brand and often a club's priorities to sell more stuff. So when you're talking about reuse, there can create conflicts of interest. And that's what's come up in multiple sports. It can be hard for some of these conversations to be taken. So I think that might apply to you. I'm going to start now on the next case study, cricket, because I think we have Kendall here, who is participation manager for cricket.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you so much to Joe and Martin for the help. I'm going to be really honest that this has just been sort of a little bit of a learning for us. Not an expert in this field, it was just an idea, and I'll talk you through that. So I work for the Yorkshire Cricket Foundation. For those that aren't aware, that is the charitable arm of the club. So we're working, my role within head of participation for the county is to look at how we can make cricket accessible for all. I'm not looking for the next Joe route. I'm looking for using sport as a tool for good, essentially. And although there are a lot of, we know of Lord Taverners that were really useful in terms of sending their kit to our programmes such as Wickets that we deliver in our county, it sort of triggered a little bit for me to think, well, that's still quite a lot of environmental, you know, transportation costs, environmental costs. And previously Yorkshire had always sent quite a lot of kit overseas. Now I work in a lot of the 1% areas of Yorkshire in terms of deprivation, and I work a lot with refugee communities, and I can honestly say that there is a bias that I think, you know, we should be helping our communities first and foremost. So yeah, that kind of sparked a bit of an interest, because one of my colleagues who was sat next to me, an ex-cricketer, mentioned when we was talking about helping some of our participants, he said, I've got 6 bags in my garage and my wife's dying for me to get rid of it. And I kind of thought, if you're one person in this office and you've got 6 bags and you don't know what to do with it, surely there's something here. And consequently as well, as everyone probably is aware, in 2021, the club's sponsors, Nike, had obviously withdrawn due to recent events. And therefore we had the best part of 16 huge boxes of kit, tracksuits, tops, t-shirts, that staff were not allowed to use. And they were just sat without really a purpose. So I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to sort of whet the appetite, help the communities, as Joe mentioned, around obviously the pandemic. A lot of our communities were sort of struggling to make ends meet. So I worked with Zero Waste, which is an organisation that's ran something similar with school uniforms, those that don't know. And it's using schools as a hub platform. And they essentially have certain days where they invite all parents to drop off and donate and reuse sort of school uniform or PE kit and things like that. And it was hugely successful. You got the audience, you got the place, it was safe environment, and people came and that communication was led. So sort of with this idea in mind, got them on board to ask them if they would be able to help in terms of marketing, any sort of ideas around how to sort of showcase it. And the figures off the top of my head was about 14,000, was that 1,400 pieces of items of clothing, and it was all brand new night kit, never been worn. So essentially the best way to describe it is TK Maxx at Boxing Day. That's exactly how it was, in terms of, you know, people coming and taking stuff completely for free, which was absolutely great because it was definitely needed. The community was so grateful, and for us, you know, it was a way of giving back and seeing if this sort of had legs. So taking the concept of zero waste and this hub concept, we thought about setting up these cages, which you'll have seen images of. And these cages, the first one was launched at Headingley. Obviously the heart of Yorkshire cricket. We'd got a high footfall within the cricket centre, and it could be sort of manned by the ticket office in terms of any questions, and open hours were sort of 9 to 5. So people were able to donate and drop off kit as well as collect it. There were a few question marks around, you know, how are you going to manage this? Is it how are you going to ensure that people aren't going to take stuff and, you know, sell it on eBay? And the answer is I couldn't. It was about sort of marketing it in a way to showcase that we are trying to help people that need it and want it to access the game. So we used case studies from the pilot to sort of showcase what the purpose of this was about, and also recording. So we just put a sheet for people to fill in if they donated, where they donated from. So if they were from Huddersfield, if they were from Leeds, if they were from a certain cricket club, and if they collected any. I can't be certain if it was done every single time. But the thing that was also interesting was this concept of free. Now, yes, in Yorkshire, we like anything for a bargain, but we're also quite proud as well. And there was a general consensus that people didn't want to take things for free. So we added a QR code to the cage to sort of eliminate that, so that people could donate as little as, you know, 50p for something, and then they'll go away and think that was a great bargain. I got these 50p, as opposed to a charity case is what they sort of saw it as at first. So there was little challenges like that, but on the whole, through the marketing piece that we had, you know, in terms of BBC Look North and things, the general consensus was people were really sort of kind and wanted to give up as much as possible. So we had a lot of cricket clubs in affluent areas wanting to donate, and essentially also had requests, which Joe mentioned earlier. So a school, for example, said, you know, we would love to be able to let our kids play, but our budget doesn't allow for it. Have you got any hardboard kit bags that could go spare? And therefore that's allowed for, obviously, allowed for the schools to take part in cricket. As I mentioned, the refugee communities, A lot of them were, you know, unable to take part in cricket, and a lot of our formats typically within our communities was quite informal. So you didn't need pads and gloves and helmets and things like that to take part. But what we'd found was a lot of them stopped sort of thinking about transitioning to clubs, because they didn't want that stigma of, I haven't got anything, and you know, can I borrow your pads, mate? Like anything like that. It was quite an awkward situation for them. So the concept was to create hubs within high football. So we got one in Leeds, and then we moved another one to Sheffield at the Caribbean Cricket Club, where a lot of the heart of cricket happens in Sheffield. And then the third one is going to be at Bradford Park Avenue in September. Now, just for a bit of information, there are over 750 cricket clubs in Yorkshire. And there's two massive challenges that we've found through this. Is one, workforce, being able to manage the requests as well as the donations when people are wanting to collect, managing geographically. So we're in sort of west and south. We haven't even touched east and North Yorkshire, but we're getting requests from that. So it was what we'd like to see is us to be the flagship for other cricket clubs to become hubs and known areas, so people know that they can sort of drop off and collect and ask certain clubs, do you have this, and sort of roll that out moving forward. As Joe mentioned, we had a few single items, which we've, again, single gloves and pads. We want to try and be an organisation that can reuse every single item. So we shipped them off to Lord Taverners for them to reuse and repair or send off to India. But we just didn't want to contribute to landfill. We've just been talking about. The other part for it is the logos. If you're a particular supporter of a football club or anything like that, you'll know that it's imperative not to wear another team's logo. So some of the kit, the whites that we're given, were perfectly fine, but they had a logo on. So Joe's obviously introduced us to other organisations that have been sort of patching up the clothing for it to be reused, and that's something we're really interested in doing moving forward. But again, looking at budgets and workforce, I've made contact with Leeds Beckett University, who are going to look to build this into their sort of studies with their fashion and design and business students. So hopefully we can sort of try to overcome the barrier of obviously the patchwork and logos and sponsors. Another really interesting find was we've got a really good buy-in from our players. We've got two ambassadors. We've got Matty Fisher and Beth Heath, and they've donated their kit from last year. And just to give a bit of perspective, Beth came on Friday and donated 6 bin bags full. That's England kit, Yorkshire kit, Superchargers kit, and most of it's still got tags on. It's quite frightening how much kit they get. Johnny Bairstow came to the Ashes at Headingley fortnight ago. Without him knowing, he had 14 bats given to him, and they're about £2,000 a piece. And he didn't know what to do with them either. So there is a huge piece here that still could be explored, and cricket being essentially maybe the front runners of trying to get players to think about this. And, you know, potentially it could be something that other sports jump onto. As I mentioned before about how well received this is from the community in terms of giving, it was also really interesting that a local football foundation heard about this project, and they donated 19 kit bags, which, you know, on the face of it could be about £150, £200 a bag. And they said, well, we don't need them, but if you need them and you can utilize them, then so be it. So again, could this be something that, you know, sports collectively help one another to help reuse and recycle? repurpose, because I know that within Yorkshire, this scheme is one of the first that's sort of taken the lead in terms of sort of trying to create these hubs for sports equipment. So it's really exciting. The other thing that I'm really interested to explore a bit further, if we can sort of utilize more funding, is where's the demand? Because we've sort of got a little bit of a wish list that we've created, and we're having quite a lot of requests for women's clothing. Now that seems to be something that is not easy to access, and there's partners out there that are trying to work towards providing that. But could this be also a platform to see what's the need? Is it and certain items in particular, whether it's bats, whether it's gloves or pads, so we can sort of be a little bit more mindful when we sort of asking for certain items to be donated specifically. So I think that's pretty much it. Our next steps, as Jo mentioned, is to work with KIDA to try and tackle some of our sort of challenges around sort of geographically and obviously workforce, because at the minute it is just myself. So we're hopeful that we can sort of utilize KIDA for again making sure it's free. That's the bit that we're just trying to work through. That the cost of the purchase is purely just the delivery costs, but the items itself will be donated. And that's kind of everything from me. Is if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Kendall. I mean, it may be useful, Jo, if you run through the PowerPoints, just because in effect it will just reinforce Kendall's free flow of excellent information, and then maybe we can pick up some of your questions at the end, Kendall. Sure. You know, if that's okay. So, Jo, shall I move on to the next?
Yep, I think that was a perfect overview by Kendall. And just to give you some background on the project, I've kind of been shadowing Kendall from about March time, and we interviewed about 20 different stakeholders involved in the project. So it was people who worked in schools, it was people who donated, it was people working with asylum seekers. So we've really built up quite a robust picture of the impact of Cricket. As Kendall said, in the pilot program, they distributed 1,100 pieces. This was mainly driven by the Nike tracksuits. And the big lessons kind of learned from that was that there was a clear appetite, but also that going forward, it was to be cricket equipment focused. And this is an example of one of the cages that Kendall talked about. So this is in the Caribbean Club in Sheffield, and it's a metal cage. They cost about £500, and they can be moved on wheels in different locations in the club. But that was the destination where people could come and donate kit, but also collect it as well. So it just removed any affordability barriers, you know, to play. And then just to say that the donations were accepted from March to April. So it was really looking at the key times pre-season, and then planned also September, October for after season, when people might be thinking about what to do with their kit. In terms of the case study that we looked at, now this was specifically focused on cricket equipment. They received 410 donations. So after the pilot, people were looking to continue to donate. So that figure is from January to April 2023. And 182 donations from Sheffield. And these donations came from all types of individuals, families, local cricket clubs, and they were all kind of united on this purpose of having goods that could be reused. You know, they just did not know what to do with them. So Cricket was a really good avenue to be able to kind of move that product on. So when I interviewed Kendall, really the focus on this was about breaking down barriers, and you know, she identified that cricket equipment is one of the key barriers, especially with current climate, with inflation, and that you know, she really wanted to create this environment of reuse, recycle and donate. And within the image, you can kind of see quite a few of the people who were beneficiaries of the donations. So the twins were from the ACE program, and their mother had said, you know, it's a choice between one of them playing. I can't afford to buy both of them kit, and to kind of stop arguments between them, then none of them will have to play. So she was facing those really difficult choices, and Cricket was able to give them both kit. I'm also going to share in a little while more about the Hull refugees and the importance that Cricket has as a tool to support them integrating into you know, their new locations. When we kind of apply all of the learnings from the case study into the Golden Triangle, I think that's where it becomes super powerful, because we saw benefits across social, environmental and economic. Social wise, there is a long quote on page 27 of the report. I'm not going to read it all, but it was around people who work with asylum seekers, and they were saying that a lot of the men who'd come over from Afghanistan were actually the ones helping the British forces, you know, and they had targets on their back in Afghanistan, and they were promised, you know, a new life in the UK. And actually, they're spending a lot of time in their hotels and hostels, and Cricket is a tool to help them connect and to get some respite really from, you know, the trauma that they face. And they said, you know, partaking in sport with local community is hugely important. The release and purpose it gives the asylum seekers is obvious. Just as important is the exposure of the local community to asylum seekers who are demonized by the government and by much of the press. Having this constructive interaction reveals the asylum seekers as just regular people like the rest of us. They become human beings, not just statistics or faceless, threatening individuals. Grassroots sport is an immensely powerful thing, no more than in situations like this. And it's schemes like Cricket that enable them to participate in sport. We see also that from people who are donating. So the quote at the top is from somebody who their children had grown out of their kits, and they were looking for an organization that they could donate it to that was almost a little bit anonymous. So she says, you know, the child wouldn't say, oh, you've got so-and-so's hand-me-downs. That idea that actually people could pick up kit and you don't know where it's come from. It's just, you know, it's just to be utilized. There's no stigma around it. And I think that was really important. You know, we also saw from an environmental point of view, this idea that clubs had held lots of kit. So we had one club say to us that they'd refurbished their changing rooms and they'd found all these old storage boxes of junior kit. They'd kept what they wanted, but they were happy that Cricket could put the rest to good use. And then we've seen cost is a barrier. So, you know, something that Kendall had shared with me is that within larger families, they just don't have the money or the resource to be able to afford equipment. So they avoid the embarrassment of turning up to cricket club and not having the gear because they just won't ask for equipment. People just won't do it. And then we talked to people at the Caribbean Sports Club, and, you know, they said to me, I know my team can beat any private school, but my team has to turn up in trainers and ask that opposing team to borrow their kit. And it really affected the self-esteem of the players. And I think it was only because they had a really strong community of role models who supported them that a lot of people stayed within that sport, because there was a lot of stigma and elitism. And I think that was highlighted in the report, the ICEC report. So I do think it's fundamental that we have to reduce these cost barriers. And I think from all the interviews, of which there were many, we had many different examples of how it supported this golden triangle. In terms of impact, these figures were put together by Zero Waste Leeds using their carbon calculator, and also the equivalents that they related to. So in terms of water, they estimated, you know, nearly 2,000 standards of bottles of water were saved, nearly 200 kilograms of oil, and nearly 4,000 kilograms of CO2. We don't yet have the methodology of how they've worked these figures out, but you can see that actually reuse is having a very positive environmental effect by keeping these products in use for a much longer time. And then next slide, Martin. And then really from this, and something that was Kendall was passionate about is how do we share this information? I think Kendall is an example of somebody with an idea, with passion and purpose, who just decided to go for this and set it up. And I think that is really key. So what we've put together is a how-to guide. There's 2 different sections. One is if you're an individual and you just have an idea and you want to try, the easiest way to do reuse within your organization. It's a very easy kind of how-to guide. And then the other section is for people who want to set up a similar scheme as Kendall has done, and goes into more detail around managing stakeholders and resources needed. And within the report, we've listed, you know, the barriers, the challenges, and the lessons learned from Kendall. So that's a really good reading, you know, before going into these how-to guides. But the how-to guides are designed to be very easy to read. They're very down to earth, and we want them to be adopted really by anybody. We want somebody to be able to pick these up and implement them within their locality or within their organization. So I'm just going to kind of finish on the next slide by looking at these 2 different schemes. So, you know, a lot of this just start by people talking to each other. You know, Kendall said she was talking to the person in the desk next to her. So I think it's about starting the conversation, about just holding an event. You know, I think it's really clear the reason why we can do this. It focuses around those key points in that golden triangle. As Martin said, in terms of the amount of wastage, 2,400 tons of cricket gear could be going to waste. 52 people have to cut back on buying sports equipment. So there's a really strong benefit to implementing reuse within a club. How to do this if you're an individual? Well, to be honest, just make it as simple as you can, and hold a swap or donation day. Pick a day, pick a time, and publicize it. You know, use facilities like Facebook. If you can get things out into the local media, use that. But Facebook, Instagram were key social media tools, and just spread the word in the locality. We put together a poster that people can use that can be amended for specific times and dates. A great time is kind of March, April before the season starts, or September, October, when people are looking at having a clear out. The cost for this is really minimal. It just involves having a space, so that could be the cricket club, ideally borrowing some tables, any cost if you want to print a physical poster, but most of it can be done digitally. And then really it's just the cost of if you want to put refreshments on, tea, coffee and cake, that kind of usually gets people interested in an event. And what we've also seen is that these events can really kind of bring communities together. So people will come to donate, but they'll also stay and chat and really kind of create greater links within the community. And then hold your reuse event. And from that, some people suggested to set up a Facebook group where people could put almost like wish lists for items on Facebook, and it can continue that way. Or you could just hold other reuse days later in the year. In terms of clubs, as I say, more details are in the report, but it's good to kind of start by mapping stakeholders and understanding their needs. You know, one of the key successes for cricket was that they really had strong links to the community and they understood who would benefit from the kit, and people were able to give wish lists to Kendall, which was really important. I think it's important to agree on responsibilities within the club. You know, that's very dependent on resource, but things of like arranging the logistics of drop-offs, recording the wish lists, recording the items donated, arranging pickup and delivery of kit where needed, communicating the project and doing the Facebook posts, and kind of arranging those press releases. I think maximum it's about a day a week when I discuss with Kendall. So just kind of agreeing that time. In terms of resources that are needed, there is some time investment. It requires somebody to be good with stakeholders, you know, people who can communicate the message, a lot of passion and enthusiasm, and just basic kind of Word and Excel skills, sorry. In terms of budget, if you wanted to replicate the cricket method, their cages were about £500 and they spent about £50 on printing posters and graphics, and also access to a vehicle if you're going to use multiple hubs. Questions, have a think about where donations will be accepted. When will the donation points be open? Is there going to be restricted access? Will people be there to help man and facilitate in those locations? Will the point of donation be the same point where people can take items for free? And is there going to be any support needed, or is it just going to be self-service that you're going to put the cage there and people can really kind of donate and pick up items independently? So just thinking through those, and there's more detailed questions, almost like a tick sheet that you can use in the how-to guide that will be published on the PASIC platform. Specify what you will accept. So, Kendall has talked about the challenges of clothing. So you might want to exclude clothing, for example. So be really focused on what you will accept, and also the condition. Within the guide, we kind of give some wording in terms of how to discuss condition. Don't donate damaged helmets or clothing or gloves that have rips or are torn, for example. And then just explain how to use the donation bins. You can do this via Facebook. It's quite self-explanatory, but just make it super easy for anybody to use this reuse organization. And then a lot of this, if you want to prove the impact, is about tracking numbers. So Kendall kept a tracking sheet in terms of what had been donated and also what had been reused, so she could understand the impact that she was having and where it was going. And then communicating and monitoring this impact is really key. So that could be put in the club statement, or also shared on social media to show the good that's being done.
In closing, one of the ideas we're thinking about, so basically there'll be a report published on the detail that Joe has mentioned, and also this how to do guide written in a very, very practical manner will be made available. And then we will hopefully win a bit more budget internally to help get that message out across the country. And one of the other ideas that we're thinking about is something that I borrow from something else I've developed. So as I mentioned earlier, I founded a repair cafe. We've run 80 sessions now. We're one of the more advanced ones in the country. So I sat there at the beginning, did the test sessions, a lot of the very practical things that I know and can recognize from what Kendall has set up. And now what I've set up is a group, a wider peer-to-peer network in Surrey amongst other repair cafes to share the knowledge. So for us as an advanced, person doing this with people who are setting up. So the sort of idea here of maybe setting up some sort of peer-to-peer networks, maybe if we could find people who are starting to use the how to do guide, getting together, people sharing knowledge and experience, and helping people to get stuff done. So I think what's different probably here with the repair cafe sessions is in the initial stages, it's probably good to focus on, the pre-season and post-season sessions. But I think, as I understand it, Kendall, you've also got some ongoing donations happening, outside of those periods as the awareness is being raised. So that becomes another logistical issue rather than sort of managing the specific events, if you like. So any comments from you, Kendall?
Yeah, victim of our own success, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
No, it's been brilliant. It's been a real journey, and as I said, came in with this just with an idea, but learnt so much, and we've not been sort of from the beginning, we've not said that we've got it all right. There's going to be still things that we're going to take from this moving forward, but one of my other biggest learnings is there's a lot of great people out there wanting to help one another, and I think that there's a lot still to go at here in terms of research, in terms of ECB, in terms of funding, but yeah, it's been a real pleasure working with you, so thanks very much.
So as I understand it, your goal is to, apart from what you're doing in Yorkshire, is to get the message out and help more reuse happening across the country, to support communities, to support participation.
Yeah, I think the vision is, obviously I want cricket clubs to take take a lead on this as well, using the how-to guides and using sort of the case studies and the research as an example of what they can do in their communities, because I think that we can only do so much ourselves, but we can help sort of create a platform for others. And what's really refreshing is there's a lot of cricket clubs that are sort of on with this around creating a community of giving and taking down them stigmas. So cricket clubs essentially within Yorkshire, I'd love to influence and empower to take this on board. But again, similarly, I think if we can look to go online to be able to sort of provide an opportunity for other counties who are maybe not quite there yet, or still sort of thinking about it. And then, like I said, the other bits around working with the universities around the rebranding and trying to get the players to continue to share and give their stuff, because it's high quality equipment that anyone would snap their hands off for. So yeah, plenty of different directions to go out, really.
Okay, well, I'll open it up to any questions or observations or thoughts. Does anybody have any questions, observations for Kendall or for Joe? Or is it interesting? Did it make sense? Do you think there is a need? We need some feedback, guys. Anybody can jump back in with it?
I can give you some feedback.
I'll jump in, Martin. Yes, there is. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Go on.
You're welcome to carry on, and I can wait until you're finished. It's no problem.
Okay. There definitely is a need, as you know. And Joe, I'm interested in the language that you use to recruit stock, as it were. And I can see you mentioned it in the briefing there. How that can influence the way people donate, and even the word donate has a kind of certain baggage attached to it, if you like. So I wonder, whether, and it'd be interesting. I know Kendall mentioned about getting more kind of professional advertising people involved to do it. What will come out of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you want to take that, Kendall. I found that most people are down to earth. I think you need to just speak, speak openly. I do think there is a bit of a stigma around donations. That's come up in previous research as well. People don't necessarily like handouts for free. There's a certain buzz that they get as getting a bargain versus being seen as charity. So I think that's really important. I think when it's linked to participation to play, actually the reuse is just a tool to help participation, so it kind of reduces a little bit of that charity angle. It's just like, well, the kit's here and you get to play. So in some ways it's a different message, but I do think it's about just talking with authenticity and being quite honest. I think even with all of the messaging in terms of how we talk about condition, for example, people will still donate what they think is good condition, and that might vary. It's very personal. But I think most of the reuse schemes, the people who have donated and used it, they're just kind of down to earth people that actually are facing huge financial barriers. And they also, for a lot of people, it's just common sense. It's how we worked many years ago. You would use hand-me-downs, you would pass it on to a friend. So for a lot of people, it just makes sense. And I think when we approach it in that way, especially with the sustainability angle, it engages a lot of people, rather than when we focus too much around the affordability and have-nots. I don't know, Kendall, if you want to elaborate on that a bit more.
I just think in terms of the array of people that we've been able to help, it's not necessarily always been the deprived. You know, it's been people that haven't been able to get access, whether that's schools or even cricket clubs that are, you know, have requested hard balls that are going and things like that, because the club's financially struggling as well. So the key part, which is not necessarily my expertise, but it's around that marketing, isn't it? It's showcasing that it's for everyone and anyone that wants to access it, and the stuff isn't necessarily overly worn, or, you know, it's just ready for another home and a second life, really. And again, similarly, when you've got ambassadors that are donating their stuff, it, you know, who's to say that they haven't had these pads weren't a players at Yorkshire and things like that. We don't constantly want to market everything as being from Yorkshire, because that'll encourage probably it to be sold on eBay. But the point is we've got ambassadors that are in the professional game who want to give back and create that sense of giving, and that's the ethos around it, as opposed to helping the, you know, deprived or anything like that, because it's making it accessible to all.
So just adding a couple of points to that. I mean, that's, I guess, the language around reuse. So a lot of the schemes will use the word recycling, although it is reuse. So there is a language issue there. What we've seen emerge around, you know, sustainability in fashion is terms like pre-loved, not using the word. So there is a language issue. I'd say there's two issues around to personalize it, I guess, more, you know, so there's an angle there. I'd say the other thing is not just the donation of the gear, it's donations to support the initiative. So again, I'm bringing in my experience from the Repair Cafe there, and essentially there's a balance there between not shoving please donate in people's face, but having it visible, you know, having the QR codes. And what we've found, again, our experience of 85 sessions, is that people are decent people. If you know, that's, again, you know, as Kendall was saying, I can really resonate. You know, there's a lot of good people out there, and there's a lot of very reasonable people. If they see there's a good initiative happening in the community, people will support it. And we have situations, again, it's not exactly the same, but there are parallels where people will come in, they won't necessarily get their product repaired, but they recognize it's a good initiative, and they will still donate to support the initiative itself. So I think there's, you know, some other broader lessons, because one shouldn't be shy to sort of to go out, because it takes money and time, you know, takes money to buy the cages, it takes money to support the salaries, you know, to make these things happen. And so I think that's another element to it, maybe. But Elizabeth, you wanted to make a question?
I just wondered if it's possible to have a chat with yourselves in regards to your research from an overall perspective, because I think, although you've mentioned previously you've been focused on the equipment, in terms of sustainability and the research I'm looking at from an events perspective, I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of principles as to what you've been facing, because one of the areas I'm focused on is trying to redevelop the supply chain within an event. So that would have some focus within sporting events, festivals, as well as, you know, smaller events and exhibitions and things like that. So it would be great to look at your aspect and build from it, if that makes sense.
My personal point of view, maybe Joe might be able to engage with you. I'll be struggling a bit at the moment, but in fact, the previous call, I also have another role of head of circular economy for British Standards Institution, and I've been talking about the creative industries and sustainability. And actually, there is this ISO standard, as you may know, on sustainable sports. And that actually is being fast tracked now for a revision because of the Paris Olympics. So my recommendation is to actually tap into that group, and I'd happily connect you into that group, because you'd have probably a much more direct group of people who are really trying to tackle these issues in terms of the events industry, which would be probably hit a number of your buttons for your PhD, as I understand it.
Yeah, most definitely, and I would really appreciate that. Thank you. But one of the important aspects of my PhD is looking within the supply chain at the different aspects that will be required within an event. So the equipment for the actual event to take place, for example, the food and beverages, the graphics, things like that, and looking to pull the actual supply chain apart, look at its individual aspects of sustainability, then looking at bringing it back together as a whole with all these aspects, given a sustainability passport for attendees and usage. So there's always going to be that overlap with the equipment also, but I'd appreciate both if that's okay.
I'm happy to chat, Elizabeth. I work more broadly across different sports and equipment. I'm working on projects for other sports at the moment around this. So yeah, it's a big question when we start to look at supply chain of equipment and clothing. We do see practices with like opt out of certain items. Now you can opt out of your marathon t-shirt, for example, where you just start to remove these items. But there's a big problem also with things like marathons where people take off their clothes at the start of the marathon and dump them. What happens to those? And then you've got the whole supply chain of the merch that goes into these sporting events, and how do you dig into that? But I'm happy to have a chat with you about that.
I guess it's a generic question wearing my PhD supervisor hat is to be clear about your focus. If you're looking at those people who are running events, it's the gear and equipment and facilities to run these events. And generally speaking, there will be some element to do with some of the clubs maybe buying some cricket gear, but most of their procurement will be around, catering services, energy management companies, stuff that I'm sure you've talked to Chris about. So again, I would just really hone in your focus, and maybe just so that we can sort of finish up roughly on time, because we're a little bit over, I'm aware, for everybody's time. Does anybody else have any, other questions or thoughts?
I just want to say, I think, Kendall, it sounds like a really great program that you're running in there, and I might drop you an email, have a little chat to you about it a little bit more. But yeah, sounds really exciting.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I just wanted to also come back to Chris's point about communication. I think it's really about normalizing this as a practice, as it once was maybe 30 years ago. It's not something new. It's how we worked in the past. And actually, your community is your biggest advocate. So the word of mouth thing, they will communicate your message for you and the tone at which they share it. So I think it's really about engaging community and normalizing it, making it a standard practice. We've seen that in other sports like football, Forest Green Rovers. It's just part of how they do. It's part of their DNA. So I think we need to focus on that much more in terms of communication.
Going back again from my parallel experience there, word of mouth is the most powerful form. It is a general marketing point. Word of mouth is the most powerful form of communication. And these sort of initiatives, if people get good experience from it, they will tell other people. And often people who are playing cricket know other people that are playing cricket, or they've got kids, or so I would say, that's, if they have a good experience, I think there will be inevitably be a ripple effect within communities. So anyway, guys, thanks you all, and thank you, Kendall, thank you, Joe, for your impromptu, Kendall, excellent presentation there. So thanks for getting out of your joining us on that, and thank you all very much for your engagement. And if you see any linkages, please contact us, and we'll be happy to follow up. So great, thank you all, and have a great evening. Okay, cheers.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.